I mentioned the sort of importance of forest within the context of the human habitat in the city. And last night we had some sense of the density of cities, the sort of need to deal with that density and the challenges of layering nature within the context of the city. And so we're going to be able to see a project that really had to take that challenge on head on. So that it's Serena Nelson with Nelson, Byrd, and Woltz, and Patrick Cullina. God, I took it 5 minutes and I already forgot what it was. are gonna share that project with you.
All right, good morning, you guys. Thank you for having us here. So I'm Serena Nelson with Nelson, Byrd, Woltz, no relation, just to clear the record. Thomas Woltz always tells me to just walk in the room, don't mention it, just let people think it, and don't worry about it. But no nepotism, there's no relation. But Susan Nelson, Warren Byrd, and Thomas Woltz are the names behind Nelson, Byrd, Woltz. And we have offices based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and New York. About 25 people in the Charlottesville office and 15 in the New York office, and field offices in Houston, Texas, and Melbourne, Australia, that have all popped up around, really been work-centered. As our work has expanded into other territories, we've found the need to grow the office. And so our work, I think, the focus of the symposium on horticulture, the work of Nelson, Byrd, Woltz begins with an understanding of ecology that started for many of us in our education. And Warren Byrd was on the faculty at the University of Virginia and taught horticulture and ecology, and was famous for his plant walks, taking people out into the Blue Ridge Mountains and learning about ecology and about plant communities sectionally, literally from walking from the bottom of a hill to the crest of the mountain. So there's a huge range in the type of projects that our office takes on, but they're all connected through a lens of cultural narratives and ecological narratives, and a focus on design excellence. So Garden Park Community Farm is our monograph that speaks to the range of that work. So about 70% of the work of the firm now is actually mostly large-scale urban parks, a lot of which are on structure, including this one, Hudson Yards, which for our office, for any office really, was an amazing opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime. It's 26 acres in the heart of Manhattan, which just doesn't become available. The city is built edge to edge, the island of Manhattan is. And this site was left undeveloped because it had been the rail yards. So this is the team from our office: Thomas Woltz, who's now the sole owner of the firm, and Jeffrey Longhenry and Mark Streeter, two senior associates. Myself and John Ridenour and Charlotte Barrows are kind of the primary team, but almost everybody in the office has had some hand in this project. So some of the names listed there are no longer with us, have gone on to start their own practices, but Simon, David, in this photo, this is for Chris. Chris, look, there's Simon. But this is going back to the days of the competition, so it was actually 3 firms were invited to compete for Hudson Yards, and it was actually an intersection of the developer-related and a zoning decision that had come from the city to basically sell the rights to build over the train tracks, and half of the site had to be open to the public. So going back, this is a picture of Stephen Handel, the ecologist. The process that we brought to this exercise of the competition phase was to bring in experts and look back to the kind of ecological past of this site. So the 2 red rectangles represent the eastern and western yards. And looking back, we were on the edge of pre-development Manhattan and actually at the outflow of these streams and marshland. So looking forward, that was the reason that the site was available, was undeveloped, because it wasn't ground that was suitable for building. And that was why the train yards ended up occupying that part of the island. And then also as we were digging in, we met with historian Jill Jones, who wrote a book called Conquering Gotham, about the history of the rail industry and its role in shaping New York City, but specifically the design of this tunnel, the Long Island Railroad Tunnel that brings commercial traffic, train traffic into Manhattan, and was at the heart of transforming New York as an economic center of the city. So when we looked back, this shaft, that black dot that you see on the slide there, marked the point where the sighting tower that was part of the structure used to build the tunnel. There were actually 2 of those on either side of the river. The sighting tower that was kind of the heart of the beginning of this, what at the time was this huge kind of technological innovation to be able to dig through the muck of the riverbed from the 2 kind of granite shelves and to connect. These sighting towers actually calibrated the progress of the construction of the tunnel from either side of the river, and they met in the middle. So one of the concepts that came out of, the concept design process was the idea of just marking that place as this kind of focal point when you've got a kind of forest of towers that are going to go up around this site. Identifying something that would be at an intermediate scale, kind of 5-6 stories, more human, but marking this kind of point of innovation on the site. And we also saw it becoming ventilation infrastructure. And to skip ahead, to fast forward, that was the kind of key component that the client really latched onto. And after a few iterations, the design evolved, but the central focal point, Thomas Heatherwick was hired to design what is known as the vessel that's at the heart of the site. Again, this is all happening over an active train yard. So just the connection back to that cultural narrative of innovation, of technological innovation, is a kind of narrative link that connects, that historical story of the site and the city to the vision of this site and the city that we see today. So the landscape has many features, which we'll talk a little bit more later, but it itself, the platform sandwich that creates and supports the landscape that sits above these train tracks, is a part of that legacy. And so this is showing the kind of the team of the project. Is obviously an extremely complex endeavor that we were undertaking, but with this massive team of experts from structural engineers, traffic engineers, life safety, all the infrastructure of the plenum and the platform that spans over the train tracks itself. But then on our side of the spectrum of the expertise, we wanted to bring on early Patrick Cullina and Pine and Swallow, Paul Cowie, these experts in the industry in terms of soil quality, in terms of trees and horticulture, to really set the standards and set the bar high for our expectations for the work. So from concept to construction, from those early visions of what the site could be, and to seeing things come in on site. And my personal role has really been mostly involved in hardscape, in kind of spatial design and hardscape construction. And that goes from early design, where we were sort of gesturing, sketching, to, CA details, where we were figuring how the masonry would join and wrap corners, and how these walls would support the soil volumes that needed to support the horticulture that defines the project. So these walls are really critical to how that happens. And then these are 2 of my colleagues, again, as I mentioned, Jeffrey Long-Henry and John Ridenauer, who really took the horticulture design and the planting design head on, along with others in the office, but did a lot of the work out in the field, going to nurseries, working with Paul Cowie. And it's been a long process, years in advance of finding the right trees, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. But And then just, obviously collaboration with contractors. We were really lucky that with Tishman, the contractors in this project, they happened to be all landscape architects. I guess they transferred them, they put themselves into the world of construction. They were obviously brought onto this project knowing it was a landscape on structure. So really good partnerships with industry, with our developer friends. And then from there, I'll jump in, or let Patrick jump into his involvement.
So a little bit about my background. I started in horticulture, working at Rutgers University in affiliation with the Landscape Architecture Department on the school's Arboretum teaching collection, and then was affiliated somewhat with the school's breeding program, which is mostly specialized on hollies and dogwoods. But it was a pretty diverse woody collection. I think what we're going to talk about today is largely the herbaceous layer, which has become more of a consideration in recent years. But the picture, and then from Rutgers I went on, I was vice president of Brooklyn Botanic Garden for a number of years, and during that period was asked by the city to come to the initial kind of design concept meetings for the Highline to talk about the efficacy of various approaches and any recommendations for strategies, whether they were related to planting or to kind of maintenance or eventual maintenance. And so now I work in affiliation with firms of all types all over on a lot of big civic projects. And interestingly, as a lot of cities have done, a lot of them are landscapes on structure, which have their own series of considerations. So that's what we're going to focus on here today. I first became aware of the Highline as a trespasser. That's my picture from a bunch of years ago. Highly recommend trespassing before these things disappear, because the structure had been condemned during the Giuliani administration, and that it was deemed said it was a physical obstruction to the development of the West Side, and then it was an eyesore, and so that it needed to come down. And it was a fully grassroots effort that kind of rallied local folks to rescue this structure without even knowing what they were going to do with it yet, but it had been this sort of wildscape that had developed on an old freight rail. And the future of the yards is actually, and it's a longer story, is actually tied to the indemnification of the Highline, because the agreement to pursue what was originally going to be a West Side Stadium, either for the Olympics or for the Jets, became part of, okay, if we save the Highline, we can give support for the rezoning of the West Side. But you can see the massive scale that we're operating on here. So here, I don't want to over-romanticize all of the condition of the wild part of the Highline, but when it was great, it was really often great, and it's not that way all the time. If you see on the upper left, that's the 30th Street spur looking east, and that's what it looks like in early spring, and then in the fall, that sort of co-dominant meadow of Eupatorium and little bluestem is pretty dramatic. So there's Pete Odoff and Roy Diblick examining these plants in the field. So when we were first anticipating the arrival of the yards, we were looking at a structure that was actually, the datum for the plaza is actually 3 feet higher there than the Highline. You're going to step up at that part to get onto it. And you saw these big wide open skies, but really, as you'll see later with the light studies, we were dealing with the anticipation of some huge structures. On the Highline here, which was obviously led by James Corner Field Operations with help from Pete Odoff in planting design, you see starting off in the southern part of the line at the Gansevoort Woodland. This is kind of where I first came in to talk about plant selection. And there's gray birch, the Betula populifoli in there that has kind of grown up from humble beginnings, and then these ground planes. So when we're considering plants for these landscapes on structure, we're anticipating the responses to soil volume. In this case, you're dealing with about 18 inches of media there, which is not very much. And so you're not just calibrating how woody plants can perform there, but what are the various sort of performance aspects of herbaceous material as well. And what we found was interesting in being I was there for a couple of years full time, and the impacts that it had on the community, where people are constantly asking questions about what is this plant and what does it do and how can I do this and how can I do that, and kids were just kind of running around on the bridge enjoying the spaces, was a different experience for me, because at the Botanic Garden, when you work in a botanical garden, that's the cathedral, and anybody who goes there is pretty much the choir, right? They're already captive. But in a park that's free, that anybody who visits that can wander into, we weren't sure what the response was going to be to the level of diversity there. And so one story I tell about it is that the plant in the middle there, the red plant, is in Naudia macedonica, a humble little Mediterranean plant, right? So I had a client who was a journalist, and her husband is a Nobel Prize-winning genius, right? She loves to garden. He doesn't really care. He loves his wife, but not interested in plants. After the Highline opened, I got a note from her. She said, "I love it. Everything is great. My husband has to know what's the name of the little red flower." So that's when I thought, well, we're probably in decent shape, right? People they're looking at things in a different context, and they're able to see things. And I think we're able in these project descriptions, particularly with these limited soil volumes, to predict which plants are going to perform reliably relative to their size of installation and their adaptability over time. So you can see that we started with little whips of sassafras that eventually grew in and became much more substantial. So the Gansevoort woodland again on the left side, you can see how limited the soil volume is and all of that production that came from that. And it's interesting, the original premise for this part of the line was river birch, which is a much bigger, in my opinion, was too big a plant, but a much bigger plant. And so it was my sort of childhood memory of going through New England and seeing these gray birches growing out of cracks in between rock outcroppings to think, well, this is a plant that you can grow more as a thicket that would adapt to the limited soil. And as luck would have it, river birch was accidentally put in at installation. We left it in there. And so you can see the difference in scale between the two. But we're talking a lot today about sort of the herbaceous layer in the yards. And one of the approaches with planting design, or a way to consider it, is that we are functionally, when we're creating these herbaceous plantings, we're taking a sort of a stage of open field succession and sort of trapping the plants in that stage, right? So the difference between the lawn and the meadow is the mower, which is ongoing, right? And the difference between the meadow and the woodland is annual mowing. Because if you dig into those grasses, you'll find the sort of successional pioneer species, and then the seed bank of all the rest of those trees around it would eventually, unmolested, return it to woodland of a fashion, right? So by cutting things back, we're just taking the inherent dynamic characteristics of these plants and we're managing them to greater effect. So here's an example. I do ongoing work at the Poly Hill Arboretum on Martha's Vineyard. There's their far barn. That's also their lecture site. I was given a talk there one night, and I was kind of waxing rhapsodic about this meadow, and they're like, "Oh, that's just junk, we'd burn it." And I said, "Well, no, there's a lot to like in this space, right? So if you dug in just in that part of the summer, in addition to the goldenrod, which is Solidago odora, there is Liatris scariosa there, the variety Nova Angle, which is endangered, Pycnanthemum tenuifolium in the middle, Asclepias here. So there was enough ornamentally going on, but I was more interested in the woody plant. So I got on a cold ferry and went back to get this experience. This is Rus copalinum variety latifolium. And so that plant's bulletproof. So if you can figure out a way to say, where's a place in an urban project that has to fend for itself, that's the kind of candidate that would work for you, right? So you can start to think creatively about what your opportunities are. And so I've made sort of this ongoing study of austere landscapes, really, because you want to find plants not how they perform on their best day, but how they perform when they're pushed. And so in the coastal plain, which is in this case, which is largely sand, again, Solidago odora with little blue stem on the left, Baptisia tinctoria, so our summer blooming eastern native. That's all going on there. If you pan to the right, which is closer to the shore, and the sand gets a little thinner, it switches to formerly Solidago, now Euthymia graminifolia, the grassleaf goldenrod, there with little blue stem. There's the green is the roost. There's bearberry in there, and this is what it looks like in the fall, right? So if I designed a roof like that, I'd be pretty happy. And then all that stuff is living with really very little fertility and very little water. So those kinds of environments become inspirational for a number of reasons. You know, there's a little spit of land on Long Island Sound there on the left-hand side, Vernonia novoborcensis on the left, just a few inches above the salt line. The salt marsh is Spartina, obviously, and then on the right-hand side, or in the middle, hibiscus, there's eupatorium in there, there's high bush blueberry, there's Rosa virginiana. All of that stuff growing on a sandy spit, all of that stuff adaptable to these projects. And then we're able to take the places that can handle some salt and then move them into projects like we're working on with Reed Hildebrand in Boston, this Pier 4, which is going to get some inundation from the harbor, which is functionally saline. Riparian communities are interesting for a number of reasons. You know, plants that can take inundations. Some of those plants are also some of our most drought-tolerant plants. Ilex verticillata on the left, the alder in the center. The alder growing next to the ilex is actually fixing nitrogen not just for itself but for its neighbors and providing sort of sustenance for those surrounding communities, which is kind of a fascinating way to explore plants. And then, you know, things like this Aster azureus growing just basically in rubble. So you start to say these are things that can be adapted. Now, as we start to pick species, or pick plants, I should say, there's a couple of ways to go. The top two and on the left are all rhododendron paraclimenoides on one stretch of hillside in western Connecticut. You see the seedling variation there. So I'm talking earlier about seedlings and the need for genetic diversity. And so they're slightly all different from each other and all interesting. And here's a cultivated variety, a clone of Rhododendron atlanticum, or at least a perceived hybrid of Rhododendron atlanticum called Marydell, that will give you that one condition continually. So you have to then calibrate your expectations for when you need the diversity and when you need the uniformity. Some of these lessons are not that hard to learn. The one on the left-hand side, I'm going to keep trolling them until they stop doing it. That is the Boston Convention Center. It's this like ongoing 10-year hostage crisis that happens every wintertime because there's no evergreen plant that can live upright in the wintertime without burlap. And even when they take the burlap off, they're still burned, and then they replace them. So, you know, eastern red cedar in an urban environment does that readily. The native exotic thing. So here's a native ground plane on a project I have up in Winter Harbor, Maine, just above Bar Harbor. And, you know, everything in there is from the region except for the hawkweed originally, which would have come from Europe, but has been here for hundreds of years, is not invasive, is pleasant, so it just stays there and coexists, and we move on. So we're not sort of slavish about the distinction between native and exotic. It's more about invasive exotic that is displacing or harming or damaging something else. Navigating the commercial market. You know, New York and New England asters are susceptible to powdery mildew in our area. So there is on the left. They're still common in the trade. You will never find that on formerly aster, now Symphytrichum oblongifolium, which is a really, really good aster that we have flowers on it until Thanksgiving, really. You can start to like explore and parse different genera, in this case Helenium. There's autumnale and flexuosum in the center, and then all the different hybrids that have come from that. So you want to, we're looking for plants that have performative value, not just aesthetic value, right? Because otherwise we're just trading in novelty and we're just decorating. So how do we have something that has some staying power? This variety, Mardi Gras, has been great. So it has some staying power and we'll be able to work with it. When you get to, and we'll get to a little bit of this later, when you get to the sourcing moment, try to avoid, and as we've been somewhat successful doing, people sourcing by genus. You ask for Eryngium yuccifolium and they show up with Eryngium planum. And you say, where's the other one? And they say, what's the difference, right? Which is a painful, ongoing question, the what's the difference question. It's like, well, you went through this process. The main difference is we can grow that. We can't grow that. So that's a pretty big difference, right? So some people can, we can't in most of these conditions. So if you've spent the time sort of vetting these decisions for real reasons, you have to stick to the fight, you know? And so there are plants that are valuable within this kind of realm of plants that can also be challenging. So same thing with the mildew issue. So finding things like a Phlox paniculata that can work for you is important. Dealing with, looking to the plain states and to the Midwestern prairies, we have a lot of that growing on the highline. Echinacea pallida here in the wild, here on the highline. It's been a functionally perennial echinacea, which isn't the case, you can say, for a lot of the hybrids. There's one of Pete's selections in the middle that's Fatal Attraction. Two more Midwestern plants, Salvia azureus and Dahlia purpurea. All have been great in these limited soil volume conditions. Amorpha canescens, the lead plant, another Midwesterner. There it is in bloom, and then it still keeps that smoky purple seed head late into the season. So those are individual groups that we might dig into, but we have sort of these large kind of matrix bases that we work from. This sort of the durable undernote that kind of holds everything together. Grasses are a great example of this. Top left and right is Spirabolus and Butiloa, and the bottom Muhlenbergia and Panicum. And so we'll mix up different warm season grasses and mix in cool season grasses to sort of extend that season. Our cool season material in the east starts a month before the warm season plants do. So we want to have that sort of extended coverage. So that's one durable component in the matrix. A long-lived, bulletproof, genus like Ampsonia, and there are many different Ampsonias that come from the Ozarks and go all the way to the east. You have Tabernet Montana salicifolia, Hubrichtii, illustris, ciliata, etc. So you have this kind of incredible ground plane of a grass-like plant that blooms, and then its fall color is either gold or yellow or some version. And then you have the static ground plane that can be pierced by other things like the Heliopsis. Another durable plant, like a multi-decade perennial, the Baptisia group, anything Baptisia alba, Leucantha, Australis, and then various hybrid forms that have been developed, which have been used to great effect. As just an example, at the Lurie Garden that Pete did in Chicago. And so one of the nice things about these big kind of matrix-driven landscapes is you can experience them in two ways. You can experience them in this dramatic vista, right? Or you can be that person on the path who then looks down into the plantings and sees that little bottle gentian in the middle and has that moment that says, I've seen this really unique blue flower that I haven't quite experienced before. So the way that matrix gets used, it can be used at different levels of complexity. This is when I was at Brooklyn with the entrance of the visitors garden. The visitor center that we did with Weissman Freddy, where the two entrance beds are detention basins managing stormwater from the parking lot, mixing, in this case, there's different types of Ampsonia, Panicum, and a few other things, and Nyssa sylvatica. So, not complex, very complex, right? The blended form, the more complexity you have, the more leeway you have. You don't have to chase, any single experience and make sure that it's preserved so that the rest of the landscape is legible. Like if you took out any one of the little Butiloas, you wouldn't necessarily lose the show. And so, in this case, Serena will follow up with what the client wanted, like what the client was interested in, and how the Hudson Yards client is not the Highline client. So those are sympathetic but different approaches. The important thing to consider about the plant selection in general is, which I find fascinating and I find distinct from architecture in this regard. On the left-hand side, if you were designing like an interior, like a kitchen, for example, and you were going to do a counter, and the counter could be made of concrete, or it could be made of tile, or it could be made of corian, or it could be made of granite, whatever, there's a delta in cost between all of those things, right? The level of preciousness. With plants, if the plants are the same age in the herbaceous world and the same size, absent of a royalty, they're the same price, right? So the real responsibility is conveyed to the chooser to make the appropriate choice when on a net level, the resources were there to achieve, the best possible result. And the other fascinating thing I find about plants, which seems counterintuitive sometimes, is that the minute you set a plant on the ground, that plant is a button bush, it's not even in the ground yet, it begins to interact with its environment, right? These are impacting, local habitats, pollinators can swarm them before they're even planted, right? So that you have that other opportunity to make a real impact in the local community. And it's not just enough to want to have these things or to talk about, well, they're great. You develop relationships, like with this is Pierre Benaroup, who's a legendary plantsman and nursery owner who owned Sunny Border Nursery. And he's growing Pycnanthemum unicum. So even though the business is still chasing the novelty of candy-colored echinacea there up at the top, there are these other plants there, and so you kind of reward them for growing them by making sure that you integrate them into your planting designs. This is a project on an island up in Maine, and so you can achieve this in limited ways. We're on a little boat taking plugs over and drilling these holes with an auger and developing herbaceous meadows from plug stage, which is a really economic way to do it. And we're still talking about design, we're still talking about inspiration, we're still doing these repetition diagrams to get people a sense of what their expectations are. Up in the right, that was for the Air and Space Museum, where we were talking about plants that might be reminiscent of flight. So you can still build narratives around these things, but there still has to be a functional component that is important, right? Because the performative aspect of it is crucial. So that when you do this installation, you give the people who are taking over the chance to succeed with it, right? You're not setting someone up for a real challenge.
Yeah. So with that, we'll jump into Hudson Yards. So a quick overview of the design. So the vessel, again, is this focal point meant to be a draw at the center of the site. And these kind of elliptical lines became the concept, almost like a sundial pattern originating at that center point and gesturing each one to the major towers across the site. So we call them the kind of major and minor ellipses. So the darkest lines point to kind of each major building or building entrance. And then I'll just jump to this. The secondary ellipses, as we call them, define the major landscape spaces. So the North Garden, the Central Plaza, and the Grove. And the elliptical geometry also sets up the patterning system and the structure for site walls and topographic changes. So we actually have about 8 feet of grade change as you come from 33rd into the center of the site, the north part of the site, into the main plaza, and 12 feet of grade change from the lower kind of left-hand part of the site, that's 11th Avenue, and up into the main plaza. And so the walls and these elliptical spiraling forms, offer kind of dynamic flows of people into the space. And that's part of the idea of the design. It's meant to be sort of a unifying geometry that's taking this irregular space and all these different kind of building entrances and bringing everyone in, drawing them into a kind of central gathering space for the public. So these major landscape spaces. And then the simple kind of concept of the landscape palette is this open clearing, framing a view into the vessel at the center of the site. There's a new 7-train subway extension that exits just north of our site. So many people will be coming in from the north. And these 2 major paths, one that's a kind of immersive woodland walk, and another one that is this perennial promenade. And then these kind of perennial shrub enclosure underneath the canopies and around the plaza space. So the feeling of that framing, and you kind of can't believe that that's really to scale, but it is. The vessel is massive. It's definitely about, much bigger of a focal point than we ever had imagined for what would be at the heart of this site. And it's had repercussions and impacts into the planting. It actually is, it will be shading the plaza for a good part of the day. But the kind of basic spatial framework of the planting is this sort of canopy and understory and then clearing. And then just to talk about, as Patrick mentioned, our client Related is a developer in the city. They've done lots of private buildings. They've done planters outside of their buildings that get annuals swapped out. They just are used to a color exchange at the ready on demand. So the idea of a kind of dynamic living landscape with a perennial landscape, not annuals, was a completely foreign concept to them. And they're taking on the ownership of a giant public space, a public park. So there was a huge learning curve for the client and a huge effort that we had to take on in terms of translating some of our ideas about landscape and horticulture into a kind of set of a vocabulary in some ways. But they also had expectations about it being really showy and being kind of flashy in these ways. So conceptually, we talked about the layers of the landscape from canopy to understory to the sort of shrub and ground plane layers. And we wanted to talk about these Northeastern native plant communities that are, that are sort of starting points as inspiration for the palettes that were developed. So an upland northeast forest edge, this herb field or sort of meadow landscape, and then what we talked about as these rock outcropping, where the kind of highest grade change edges are, where you get the 12-foot quite steep walls coming down on the north and south sides of the plaza. So we had to basically, and again, this is not an exclusively native palette, but it's inspired by, and it's kind of at the intersection of culture and ecology in that way, in that some of them are things that we know that will be sort of robust and deliver the show that perform in ways that the client is going to desire, but also kind of creating their own community. So we did an exercise where we described what the potentials of this analogy could be horticulturally, the forest edge, what that could look like, and then showing them examples of design landscapes inspired by similar drivers, and similarly the herbaceous material. And so we're kind of playing to the growers that are using the candy-colored echinacea, but that's the nature of the client, and wanting to have a really dynamic year-round colorful display, and then this kind of rocky outcrop concept. So the other, in addition to the kind of plant palette and species selection, is how it all gets put together. And the structure starting from the canopy, but on the ground plane, hedge elements, which become another structural component that I'll talk more about in a second. So just some early concept sketches thinking about how all these layers and then the canopy above overlap. So, as we said, the Highline for us was an inspiration, and the Highline literally empties into our site. And initially we went in talking to the client saying, oh, we'd love to continue the palette. Like, we like a lot of the things that are going on there horticulturally. And they're like, oh no, the Highline's messy. We don't want that. Oh. So, completely different set of sort of values about what it should be and what their aesthetic would be. And so starting out with these hedges as structuring elements that are going to be evergreen, and a year-round presence that could then define the dynamic layers that happen on the ground and around them. That became an important concept and a helpful concept in terms of setting the client's expectations for, year-round performance. So the design of those, kind of echoing these elliptical forms in the walls, became an important consideration. And working with Patrick on species selection. This is a Ilex crenata beehive is what we ended up going with. for the hedge species.
You know, the thing too is sometimes you clip something and you don't know when you're going to use it. In that case, it's many years later. But in New York now, with the presence of boxwood blight, it's become a real challenge in using boxwoods in large number. So you start to look for substitute plants. And beehive was a really obscure, functionally obscure selection by Elwin Orton, Dr. Elwin Orton, in his breeding program. It was a single selection from 25,000 seedlings. This is how manic this process is. But what I remembered of it was that kids used to play on it and sit on it like a bench, and it never moved. So never had a real opportunity to use it, but saying what can we end up with a real rigid hedge that won't be evergreen and sort of have not have disease problems.
Right. And so we've procured it hedge, it's going to come hedge form and sort of ready to go and be that structure day one. So then this is again just kind of a tool for describing to the client what the color spectrums and dynamics of this perennial landscape could be throughout the year, and making sure there's year-round interest, and fully expecting that they'll come in with light shows. I think early on in the process, that was what they were imagining would be in the landscape, were like these like lollipop light fixtures that would who did the installation at oh well, never mind anyway. But that will be a part of the dynamics in winter, presumably. But then also looking at the canopy layers, and we've got. I'll go into more about some of the decisions on how we chose the species we ended up with. But this kind of mixed hardwood forest at the North Garden, and then blocks for the Grove and for the kind of edged on the north side of the plaza. And again, our client didn't know much about, like we were showing them these plans and talking about trees. Literally, Stephen Ross, who's at the head of Related, and I have to say I was glad that we had the opportunity to do this. He wanted us to take him around the city and show him examples of the trees, because when we were talking to him, the names didn't make any sense. He's like, take me to show me the trees. So we actually, and at that point we were also still in debate about partially design intent, but also availability and what could really work. So we organized this tree tour where we took, a little motorcade throughout the city and stopped and demonstrated what the species we were thinking about were. And that helped us to kind of narrow some of the aesthetic sides of the decision. But then there were still a lot of debates and discussions based on sourcing. So we ended up with the Metasequoia, Glyptus stroboides, Dawn Redwood as our tree on the north part of the plaza. The Nyssa sylvatica we ended up with as our grove tree. And that, I'll show you some of the photos of the tree that we ended up eventually procuring from Georgia. But then the North Garden, we really almost have all of these in the palette in the end. We don't have the American elm, but from the oaks to Amelanchier dogwood. And then this trident maple, which is definitely, it's an Asiatic variety, but it had this showy bark, and we thought would be kind of a performer with an association to a native species. And then another one, the silver bell, definitely a more southern plant, but had such a showy, nice quality that we really liked it and wanted to have it on the project. And then the gray birch, as Patrick was talking about, for our street tree planters where we knew the soil volumes would be limited, that was our choice to ensure kind of the success and vitality of those. And so this is a graphic we produced to just show kind of what the feature character and color of each of those species would be, and how much variety and dynamics you would actually get out of that palette. So this is John Ridenour in our office. Down, I think this is back in Hauke Nursery. So these trees were procured 2 years ahead of time from a nursery in Georgia, the Nyssa sylvatica. So nationwide search to find this bosque tree, and then dug and moved up to Hauke Nurseries in New Jersey, where they were, so they had basically been root pruned and they were brought up to the north, and they had time to establish. And they were working with Paul Cowie, inspecting the health of every single one. We actually ranked them in order, in equality there was like a grade that each one received. Root inspected, root pruned, and they were limbed up. So just a long process and major investment in the selections that we made. So this is now, let's see, I'll go back real quick. So this is when they were first brought to the site and getting installed, and then this is now with kind of hardscape built around them. So the Acer geranium over on the left, and then the Nistas in the foreground here. And then this was just last week. So, gosh, this was this week. This was on Tuesday. So these are oaks, willow oaks, red oak, and macrocarpa going in. And, well, I'll jump to that in a minute. The project is already open to the public. It opened on March 15th, and the landscape just wasn't done. You can see walls aren't even finished, but the retail space that is the kind of economic heart of the project had to be open because they had commitments to all the retailers that are invested there. So we're literally now a public construction site, which is an interesting place to be in. But just to go back to the soils as a foundation for these trees that, we've made every effort and every investment to ensure their vitality and success and, potential to reach maturity. But working with pine and swallow, you can see here the different soil horizons. They've got this robust soil spec where you're doing your best to sort of recreate a natural profile with organic components and a real kind of soil biology and the mycorrhizal fungi and all that will support the health of these trees. And then another crazy component to this project was that given the train yards below, there were these temperatures. We realized this when they were doing the computational dynamic modeling of the venting, the needs they had to vent the train yards below. They realized when the trains are parked in the middle of the summer, they're running their air conditioning systems, and the heat that they're outputting was creating temperatures of up to 150 degrees underneath the platform. So we just discovered this as we were kind of reading these reports and had this realization that, that's going to kill the plants. That's going to compromise the root systems, and this major investment that they've made in these trees is going to be ruined. And so we pulled in all of our consultant experts on this from Pine and Swallow. I think you were in the room too, right? And Paul Cowie, JBB Arup, to convince the client that it was worth putting in this mitigating infrastructure or soil cooling system. And it really will only be necessary that it be employed when there's a heat wave. It's not like it'll have to be running all the time, but when there's a heat wave, the system would kick on and keep the temperature of the soil from getting up too high so that it might kill the trees. So, and then another aspect of this as an urban site and the idea of our kind of green infrastructure, blue infrastructure landscapes, and touching back on the streams and the outflow, the kind of pre-development condition of the site. So we actually are capturing 100% of the stormwater on the site. We didn't have to do that. We actually had grandfathered ability to drain right out into the river. They had never regulated the dumping of the stormwater on that site into the river. But instead we're capturing it all, reusing it enough to entirely supply all the site's irrigation. And the buildings are doing the same, using water captured for cooling tower makeup. So there's even though it's kind of an abstracted ecology, right? We're not connecting back to a wetland marsh. We're not connecting back to that locality, and our kind of inspiration for the plant communities isn't about that. But yet that's still part of the site's identity to this day. And actually the same streams are now present on that site and piped and connecting to the river. So that ecological history is, hasn't been erased. And then this is Mike Aganis from Pine and Swallow, who was out on the site with me. These are the temporary planting that went in when they had to open retail. So we had a series of hilarious conversations with the developer, like, what if we want to plant in March? What if we want the landscape to be open? Can we just get the perennials here sooner? Can we just like rush everything? Well, we're like, your soils are going to be frozen for one.
If they're there.
If they're there. And the perennials are going to look like nothing. They will not have kind of started to show even in a lot of cases. So they were trying to push for this opening date. And in the end, we just said it's better, instead of trying to force that process and compromise the plants and your target end goal because you're rushing, the time scale of landscape just don't compute for them. So we said, just do what you've always wanted to do and do these swaths of pansies and tulips. So we did a temporary landscape plant, and we almost did it tongue-in-cheek. And they did it. They bought the plants, installed it for opening day, and there were these bold swaths of purple pansies and white tulips, and they were happy with it for the time being. But literally, this is what it looked like at opening, where you can see part of the site's complete and the other part's still under construction. So there's just a fence with a lot of pretty pictures of flowers on it. But that leads me to the ground plane and kind of what's coming next. So the trees are going in as we speak, and then the shrubs and the hedges will go in. And then at the ground plane, I'll just talk a little bit more about where we ended up in terms of the development of the kind of ground plane shrub layers that we talked about at the beginning. So we did sun studies looking at how many hours of sun would each part of the site get, and developing plant communities based around the limited solar exposure of a lot of these areas. Even as you can see, the vessel actually ends up casting a lot of shade on the north garden. And then imagining how that walkway would feel, and that the paths coming through would be where you feel like you're kind of bisecting the bands of these perennial swaths here. So this is just some of the concept sketches early on as those were in development. And then this is kind of where we ended up. So we have these kind of communities of color, so to speak. And then with a sort of performer, we called it in-house like a workhorse plant, like the Amsonia, so we basically ended up with these mixes. And in the planting plans that we submitted for construction, we just had these zones as hatches, and there's percentages breakdown of each plant species. And then actually later we added in bulbs to make sure we had the fullest spectrum of show we could, kind of within each zone. So I'll just flip through a few of these. And then sort of where we are actually right now, and just a few weeks ago, Patrick came to our office and we met to talk about, all right, so now from the hatch, how do we go from the hatch to the installation? We were doing all our homework, and researching heights and bloom times and trying to understand what the dynamics of these species would be and how they'd interact with each other within these mixes. But it's really great to have Patrick's expertise on what's, like he kind of thought about it a different way than we were. He's like, this plant is going to steal the show, it's going to like become the focal point in this matrix. So actually you want to install that first, even though it might be a thing that you have the least of, you might only have 15% of it. So that's kind of informing the way that we're thinking about this. And I think we're still sort of debating about how rigorous the patterns and the matrices become. But this is kind of the graphic that we're thinking about doing now, where we have these lines, And the idea of these groupings start with the kind of two most focal point species and then kind of infill from there. So this is a tool for us to think about it, but it's also going to be a tool for the contractor to use to be in the field doing installation. So these are some of the sort of shaded ground plane layers beneath the canopy. And then these are our kind of rocky outcrop plant communities. And then this was an event that Related asked us to do, this Children's Museum of the East End, and they wanted us to talk about the planting design. I can't remember if it was our idea or theirs, but anyway, it became an opportunity, and I think this is one that we hope translates to what Hudson Yards will bring to the public in general. But this was, an audience, it was geared towards children, but it was educating them about what a landscape architect is and why do parks and pollinators matter. So we've now gotten Related on board in creating this perennial landscape. But here we were telling the story of that as a green space in the network of green spaces across the city. And here we were kind of just showing them what the planting would look like and feel like, and that they could find their pollinator plant on the site when they come to visit. So with that, I'll let Patrick jump in.
Thank you. So Serena was talking a little bit about, how you go about laying things out. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples for how it's achieved sort of physically, and then how it performs over the course of like a time-lapsed year. Important thing to consider in a project like this, which takes so long, is that any landscape project, I think, is like holding, as a designer, I guess, holding a leash of like a wild dog, right? If you let go at any stage during the conceptual phases or design development or specifications and construction documents, you can lose it, or you can have the project be undermined by some decision that gets made because you weren't there to kind of marshal it, right? And on a multi-year project, it's not such a dog, it's like a dragon. It's like an enormous thing, right? Because it's many different people over the years with a lot of different site pressures related to schedule. So what you're trying to do in advance is kind of protect yourself in the future with as much detail as you can get in and anticipate as many of these challenges as you can so that you have something to rely upon when things are flying, like there's an opening in mid-March or something, right? And so in this case, in the Highlands case, which was super successful, there was actually a separate contract that was held for contract growing the plant material. And particularly on the herbaceous layer that Pete Odolph uses quite a lot, that a lot of those plants weren't necessarily available in the trade readily. And so you saved a lot of time by having it ready to go when you needed it. And it's also, since this always comes last, it's usually the hardest to predict in a schedule, like when you're going to be able to do it. I get calls all the time, help me with contract growing. It's like, well, when's it going in? So, well, we're not sure, maybe next year, maybe the year after. Well, for production purposes, there's differences between those two things. So we try to get as much information in as you can. So you make sure you get the plants you were meant to get. And then in this case, in the center, you see these kind of circles that are painted out where we're bringing in sort of these, mostly the forb layer of the different kind of blooming components. And then the part, and this kind of goes to Serena's diagram previously. So those are sort of these anchor moments. And then the field, the remaining gaps, is this matrix. And so the matrix is, in this case, in the case of I'll just show you this, the Chelsea part of the Highline, is a grass matrix of cool and warm season grasses that are going to weave in between all of those plants, and in many cases pierce some of those forms so that it is a little bit more organic. And that's largely represented as a ratio. So when we did Manhattan West, for example, we called out with James Corner Field Operations, we called out the individual locations of the plants like that, and then there was just a bar saying 2,500 of these, 1,500 of those, 500 of those, and we'll kind of blend it in the field. on really large scale, this is really hard to represent in construction drawings when things are this big, right? So, we want to be able to dictate it anyway. And then largely, if you get into a contractor situation, herbaceous is the biggest challenge for most contractors, and even recognizing what plants are. Go get me 4 dahlia. What does dahlia look like? And people are looking for labels, so it can be a really laborious process. So a lot of this planning is a way to make this part go as smoothly as possible. So just as an example, those cedar posts are actually holding spots for the oaks that came in later. But this is one section in one calendar year. On the left-hand side, a layout following spring in the middle. A little bit later on the right with Parthenium integrifolium. There's the Salvia pratensis coming on. Lower right, now we're getting into May, into June, July, August, fall. This is 1 year from installation, 1.5 foot on center, right? So if your plants are right and your soil's right, and you can deliver sort of routine moisture for the purposes of establishment, this isn't necessarily a landscape that requires additional excessive amounts of moisture or fertility. Actually, fertility is usually less preferred for some of these things, where they become overfed in some ways. And then we'll get into more about the maintenance of this in a bit. But just to give you a sense of that experience, same spot, there is the line between section 1 and section 2 of the High Line. So you can see the profile there. 18 inches of media on green roof drain board with a little bit of gravel. And then if you look at the pink blooming plant in the top left corner, that's the Monarda. Look at it again in the lower left picture. And then after the building popped up, where the old parking lot used to be, or like an old garage used to be. So now, these things are performing despite those additional forces, and all of that productivity and dynamism is coming out of that 18 inches of media. So here are some other examples. Rose Kennedy Greenway was something that a lot of different architects had a part in, including Van Valkenburg. They had one section, the Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy, had a section that didn't perform well, where a lot of the plants died out in the harbor. And so they wanted to do it as take it on as a staff experience, how it could be sort of redesigned to give some relief to the interior parts of the Greenway to really busy Atlantic Avenue where all the duck boats go rolling through. And so here's an example of from layout to establishment in the first year. Amsonia hebrictii there with Rus typhina lacunata, and then 1 year later. Amsonia is beefed up, panicum's on the spine, and the oaks and magnolias and Rus are there. These are all sort of meant to be eastern regional plants relative to the plants in the harbor neighborhood. And this is the Rose Kennedy block, so it was meant to be more like a wildflower for your mom. And so you have this kind of the sequence of seasonal, really robust plantings that the staff doesn't need to go and visit, regularly. They can kind of, as I described it before to the first gardeners on the High Line, you're not going to be gardeners, you're going to be editors. There's inherent dynamism here. You're just going to manage that and redirect it. And so I'll touch on it more visually later. So how quickly this can happen, you see on the upper left corner some plants that died out there. They wanted to move to another block. We relocated some shrubs that were overplanted in another part of the park, and then they put in simple drip lines. That is the first week of May. This is middle of summer, same spot. All right, very, very inexpensively achieved. And so you're getting this sort of sequence of sort of color and texture. Again, same spot here by the Boston Harbor Hotel. On the upper right corner, you see Liatris spicata blooming. Amsonia has finished, Baptisia has finished. You can see the seed heads. Clethra is in bud. On the lower left, you get into midsummer. There's Helenium, Vernonia, Pycnanthemum. And then in the fall, Phallogilla there, but the Amsonia now has fall color and the asters are coming on. So there's constantly this, you've taken the idea of spring, summer, fall and cut your seasons week by week by week. So people get to experience this sort of unfolding character. And then hopefully they get to appreciate the sort of the senescent character of these landscapes as well. We moved up another block. Reed Hildebrand worked on this Carousel Plaza. They got a new carousel, and so we did the same kind of wildflower scenario, again, really durable, drought-tolerant edge that people seem to respond to. So and their donors appreciated. So these are, oh, I should point out too, Rose Kennedy Greenway is another landscape on structure. It's the roof of the tunnel that is known as the Big Dig project in the city. So there's about 2 feet of media in that project. Bethlehem Steel, which I worked on with WRT. This abandoned steel site in front of these blast furnaces. These tracks are on a trestle 30 feet above these bins, and all of this emergent growth we're pushing out of the bins. I was fascinated by the performance in this really highly contaminated site. And so I was kind of looking around all the plants, and I looked up and I saw this guy from a distance, and I had to get permission from this really cranky steel guy to go look at it to verify that it was what I thought it was. And it's a Katsura tree. So there's a tree from Japan, right? That's 10 feet above the deck, 30 feet down. That's pretty impressive, growing out of darkness. So the idea became, what if we kept this and did a planting plan that was sort of sympathetic to the wildness, which is, this is not a highline project. These are a series of small interventions along a walkway above the trestle. So here's one example of, in the first season, the Styrex americanus, the American snowbell, which is not an easy plant to find, but it's really beautiful, with Baptisia and Amsonia blooming. And then a really pretty modest installation. You can see the size of the containers, largely 4 and 5 inch pots for the perennials, some 1 gallon, and then the woody plants were like 2 and 3 gallon. And so we got this activity fairly short order in the first season. And then from spring to fall, so there is the first summer on the left, and then the first fall on the right, with the sumacs doing their thing. And then, and you know, see how robust this was, the point of like what shows up if this is that aster. So if you have a project like Hudson Yards, which is one of the projects you do see in plan view, right? A lot of, thousands of people are going to be looking down, that when that becomes the big purple explosion, where it's dispersed to the landscape becomes a thing. So you really want to control, you really want to, anticipate how that's gonna marry your vision. And then just some little tricks too, like mixing up taxa, by taking Rus typhina and Rus typhina laccionata and mixing them together, you extend fall color, right? Because one comes a little bit sooner than the next. The texture is different, the size is different. Last point. When the redevelopment agency in the city, this is part of a large cultural campus with a massive music program, incredible performance schedule. There's a public television station. There's an arts community. And they weren't quite sure who was going to take care of it, and it's still kind of getting sorted out. But that woman in the upper center, Ilse, who's like 80 years old, formidable Swiss lady, has taken it on herself to I'm gonna be in charge of this. I will fix it. You tell me what belongs here and what doesn't belong here. So she's become the editor. So she knows how to kind of mind those gaps, because when you're establishing these plant communities, like in here, right? It's the gaps that you're minding until it closes. So you're doing that spacing, which we're largely working off, which is snug, like 1.5 foot spacing average. Some of these plants can be greater than 2, almost to 3 feet wide, but we at 1.5 foot spacing on an average, we're trying to get it so that they close together so that they can defend themselves. So that the self-sowing plants that are vigorous, like in this case, Symphytrichum lave, which used to be Aster laevis, if you let that seed in a place where there's lots of gaps, you're going to have 4,000 of those asters. Now that's beautiful, but it may be out of sync with what you want to do. So you're really anticipating getting to a point of having people know how to edit those moments until it closes enough to defend itself. And then the last bit about maintenance, going back to this point of telling the gardeners, your editors, we're going through this annual, ritual really, where now is largely helped by volunteers, where you're cutting back this entire space. So a lot of these projects you were anticipating, what are you sentencing your client to? What are you really asking them to engage? because it's not just that there's a lot of plants here, but this is extended 30 feet at a time over 1.5 miles. And there are thousands of people up there every day. How do you move through a crowd with these carts? How do you get all of this debris off of a bridge, which in our case, we used this giant construction chute they used to demo buildings, and it looked like a big esophagus. And we piled it all up, and then a truck came up, and we shot it all down to the street, and they drove it to a compost bin. So it was like a military operation. But kind of a decidedly medieval maintenance structure. There's somebody with a scythe there. And so you're cutting it back, and then you're letting that sort of emergent layer reveal itself, and maybe pushing back on the warm season grasses, which perform, your prairies are floristically complex. Our meadows, the warm season grasses are so competitive that they really, there's just a few stalwart plants that really hold their own, the goldenrods, the asters, the world, butterfly weeds. So we are trying to then maybe at times push back on that grass performance. But you can see in the bottom right, all the stuff that's green are cool season grasses. They've already started. And all the stuff that's still brown is still a month away from sort of activating. So we can talk about this together. So part of this ongoing thing, anticipating, having had this experience, was every time we talked about it, so can we get related to hire somebody who's can be a point person for their operation, so you're not dependent just on contractors who may not have had a relationship to the process, and become sort of the institutional memory for the organization, and become the person who marshals all the resources to get this really complex landscape to perform. And we've been talking about this idea of get a person, because if you have a project that's aspirational, you can get recruits who aspire to do interesting things. That's why we got lots of people wanted to come work at the High Line, So do you want to talk a little bit about the process?
Sure. So this is a job description. So in design, we set an ambition for the project, and we sought, from the outset, again, as I said, in establishing our team, in schematic design, set the ambitions for horticultural excellence as, a defining character of the project, and as a benefit that the public space would offer the city. So, even in schematic, I think definitely before CDs, did a draft maintenance manual for the project as a whole, working with ETM Associates, to help set expectations for what, and so the idea of having a horticultural director was first present in that. So this is something that, we're not trying to, like you just said, sentence the client to all of this work and but it's a new foray for them to be managing a landscape like this. So we've been working to try to set the expectation. They're a major organization. They have so much capacity, obviously, to build the structure, organize this feat of engineering over the train tracks. But it's been really hard for them to get their heads around the idea that this is an important role. And all these systems, from the soils to the trees to the perennials that they've invested in, it really requires someone with expertise to be in-house and on their team to ensure that lives, to its fullest potential and has success for them and for the city, really. So anyway, we wrote this as a prompt. We said, we haven't heard any motion on this, so we're like, we'll help. We'll write this job description. And so we've just been pushing it. So anyway, I think a week ago, after more than a year of pushing this and saying, here, you need to hire this, and we wanted this person to be on board before construction so that they would actually see all these systems go in and understand how they worked as they were kind of coming together. So we're still pushing them and it's just they don't understand, it doesn't compute, it doesn't seem important, they're still of the mindset, unfortunately. I'm hoping that they'll come around as they see it and live it and learn from it.
I mean, there are ways to quantify how this saves money and time and energy and frustration, but I think there are, just anecdotal examples of why it's important. So in the Boston case, I mean, that project took decades to realize, but the landscape plan they're functionally a generation removed from the people who saw that go in. So some of the work we were doing, I said, well, what are we dealing with under here for mechanicals? And they're like, I don't know. Well, how much soil are we working with here? I'm not sure. So you have this scenario where you can make the idea, which I think we can make it an old-fashioned idea in the future of saying a maintenance manual, and then merge it with the concept of what the original design intent was, and to kind of make a design intent manual that has really practical recommendations for the way that these projects can be maintained, that is less consumptive than traditional methods. I think that there is, if they go to a contractor model, somebody's going to have to still relay this concept of how things got where they were and why things matter and why other things might need a new response, right?
Yeah. So I think that may be another step that we offer. I think actually we've already offered, but yeah, that will kind of further illustrate the needs for a person to sort of have that role and have that oversight capacity.
From the owner's perspective, for a lot of times, even though it's planty, like in the sense that maybe there's more there than they thought there would originally be there. There's still that mindset that buildings are the steak, landscape is parsley, right? And that those things are fungible. So it could be X or it could be Y. It's just the stuff that you put on the bottom that sometimes has flowers. And our landscapes are much more complex now, right? So, buildings are machines and the landscapes are components of those machines, particularly in these constructed environments. And so if they're performative, if they're managing stormwater, if they're offering the benefits of permeability, if they're offering all these sort of stacked environmental benefits that you get just ecologically speaking, what you put in has to matter, right?
Yeah.
So that's what you're kind of pointing out to a client that they're committed to.
Yeah, and I think to the point of, we were talking about the annuals that went in, the pansies that went in, and in some ways we were terrified that they were going to like it. Right? They're like, oh, great, like swaths of color, awesome, like that's what it can be. I think the hope is, and in talking about the value of the perennial landscape and thinking of it as a living dynamic system that has qualities throughout the year and has sort of an ongoing life besides just an individual color show. I think we're hoping that as they live through it, they will understand it better and get more on board. So anyway, as we said, they're hiring, so if anybody...
Yeah.
All right, with
Thank
that...
you.
Yeah, anybody have any questions?
I have a question maybe for Patrick on cultivars versus the native species. A lot of these projects, are these primarily all natives, or are you pulling in cultivars on the herbaceous layer?
Well, so it's a good point, because I think that, I'll give you an example of what I think cultivar matters in an important way. Like those winterberry hollies. So winterberry hollies are dioecious, right? They're male plants and they're female plants. So if you don't have both, you don't have fruit. If you go to a nursery, do you want to go to a place where you have to guess? If you want to sex ilex flowers, good luck. You're going to need your loop, and you're going to have to hit the week where that's happening, right? So having cultivated varieties of things that are going to perform a certain way that you need in order for them to function is important. And that said, even though those plants are clones, a lot of the ilex clones were selected for the flower trade because they were so good at fruiting that they made good cut stems. So they started that way and they kind of worked their way into commerce. That plant is only one step removed from putting a seedling back into nature, right? It gets pollinated, birds eat that seed, they take it somewhere, and then it's off and running. So it's just it's strong germplasm because of the way that it performs. That's one example. Another example of dioecious that's, to me, was fascinating, which I didn't put in here because it wasn't really part of this focus, but Sassafras is almost impossible to transplant successfully from dug material, so we really stressed using containerized seedlings. They're small, they look like car antennas, so people weren't so psyched about that in the beginning. But he said, no, they grow really fast and they'll be fine. The additional bonus was that they were all seedlings and they were all from different open pollinated communities. And last summer I was walking through the High Line and I looked at the section, now these trees are way above the bridge, and they were loaded with fruit. And I don't know if you've ever seen sassafras fruit, but it's one of the most spectacular ornamental fruits that are out there. And you usually don't get to see it because birds crush it, like the day that it matures. So there are those serendipitous moments that you get out of it. It becomes a challenge in some regard. There was a point made earlier about trees that are budded. Most woody trees that are cultivars that are right now that are like magnolias, taxodium, nyssa. Most of those trees are bud grafted, right? So you're dealing with those grafted material because they grow 3 feet in the first year and they grow super fast. So you're getting clones there. In the case of what Serena showed, that green gable, it was a variety developed by the Neubauers that has a really strong triangulate crown. And if you know black gum, it can have these kind of curling, twisty leaders. So it appealed to scenarios where you needed something that had a little bit more form. So I kind of always work backward from what the intent is. If you can, if you get in some cases there are cultivated varieties of things that are indistinguishable from a seedling. So you have one thing or another thing, it might just be that was the way you sourced it. Gray birch is a point. It's often sometimes it's seen as Betula platyphila. It's not. It's a typo that is, it's like a 25-year-old, 30-year-old typo that still persists. But it's a gray birch. It's just a really strong form of it. So sometimes that's the only way you can find gray birch because somebody got good at growing those plants and then they become the one. So I take them case by case. But I think in a general sense, the goal, if you can get it, is to get as much diverse material as you can from as many different, from local provenance, so that native really becomes regionally appropriate. And we're already seeing with the, warming that these kind of lines are moving, sugar maples are pushing north and, you're becoming too much heat for things like, paper birch is an example of things that are kind of getting pushed north by heat.
Yeah.
Two comments, actually. The first being that pretty much everything that you have shown is a fabulous plant heater. So those of you who don't know the Latin, pretty good plants. No, you can't do sassafras very well, unfortunately.
Can't you? Oh yeah, right. I know that's true.
But
But this is yours.
Oh, absolutely. The other comment is we use the word manage, not maintain.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that on purpose, because to maintain a status quo, to manage suggests a much more higher level of systems thinking. And if we could get the industry that must make these work to think in terms of management of the space instead of maintenance,
Uh-huh.
it also elevates your thinking to a different level of professionalism.
Yeah, and I think you're building expectations too. This idea of messy, right? That's a big deal. I mean, I thought about this walking through your town here with these infiltration basements, some of which are under construction. The amazing opportunity you have just because the suite of plants that you have that are regionally occurring is so amazing. When people in urban scenarios, they say, "Oh, we can't have that. That brings rats," which I'm always fascinated by. The landscapes bring rats. No, not really. But when you're struggling to make a case with someone, the pollinator angle is a valuable tool because people who don't care about this care about butterflies, generally care about birds. And so it's another avenue in to build momentum behind an approach. And you say, well, actually that's a food source for the winter, or that's a habitat source that provides protection. And it actually, the grasses, the people who, it drives me bananas, but the people who cut their grasses back in the fall is actually, you're undermining the performance of those grasses by doing that. So you just let the crowns fall over, protect those things, use it for winter interest, then come get it in the spring. Those kinds of strategies, I think, maybe get people to relax the idea of messy and really get more about, as Pete calls it, dead plants, right? So it's death, uses the word death, but it's senescing, you know.
Serena, with regard to the Hudson project, Lenote knew and Louis XIV found out that strongly structured spaces and forms require legions of gardeners. What's the full-time equivalent of seasonal and part-time gardeners for the Hudson Gardens to keep that at the level you showed it? And at what point does that labor budget exceed the cost of design and implementation?
Yeah.
How many years out?
You know, I know in our maintenance manual we did quantify kind of man hours for related, but, and I don't have the answer on that offhand, but I think there is a formal rigidity to the design, of course, and the idea of the hedges, and the hedges themselves will require maintenance, so there's that. But I think the perennial landscape, you know, I mean, there's maintenance there too, but I think it's really meant to have a looser character and more of a, you know, kind of living dynamic quality. So I don't have the answer on the hours, but I think there's a rigidity to some of the forms, but I don't think it's anywhere, I think it's a lot looser in terms of the horticultural concept than, you know, some of the formal gardens of Europe. But I think there's a play between those two systems in the design. So,
You know, you have a division there's a division of labors here too, right? So you have the idea of the hedge, that's a real thing. And that's something that requires, and that's something that can be undermined really quickly by someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And you touched on it earlier. We talked about doing this well in advance to get these plants grown and to get them pre-pruned so that we weren't going to take fully realized plants that have been growing happily somewhere and then shear them and jam them together, right? These are they're being grown in a way that they're being anticipated being part of these ellipses. That's real work. So that's a consideration that is going to require attention. The herbaceous layer is cyclical, and I think this is the advantage of using these sort of large stoloniferous, like crown possessing plants that are, you know, if you did nothing to them, the stems would fall away, blow away, and they'd continue on. So all of the Ansonia, the Bapesia, the warm season grasses to a great degree, if you did nothing, would still be fine. And then you're allowed to sort of attend those gaps that I mentioned, and then attend sort of the individual cutback things which are aesthetic driven. Like in some of the shade areas, there's hellebores. So the evergreen growth of hellebores is funky in March. So if you want to go and get it, you can go get it. If you want to just let it kind of fritter away, you can do that too.
yeah.
The first Highline section, the first 9 blocks, we had 5 gardeners. So that we had 1 gardener for every couple of blocks. But factored into that was the physical logistics of trying to get through people in and out of beds. It just was a less efficient way to go. But in the case of the staff, it wouldn't necessarily, it could be a staff that manages staff, or it could be a staff that manages contractors, either way. But at least it's someone who is sort of reinforcing an approach, a specification associated with a calendar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.